It's also a signal towards the general community, but also the Syrian community, that they do have options to share their stories. They do have options to come forward with what happened to them and share evidence where possible.
Medieval crimes are being committed.
I come with clean hands.
Victims of horrific crimes want justice.
We don't have anything better than this.
This is Asymmetrical Haircuts, your international justice podcast, with Janet Anderson and Stephanie van den Berg. This episode was produced in partnership with justiceinfo.net.
All rise.
Hi, Steph.
Hi, Janet.
You know, what's been striking me yet again as we come to the end of 2023 is how many complex paths we have towards accountability that you and I are trying to keep an eye on. It was once upon a time when we were both pretty well fixated on a couple of big international tribunals, and then there was also this kind of slew of various courts that followed in their wake, and then the big behemoth, the International Criminal Court, with all of its expectations and effects and disappointments. But now we're really looking all over the world at national proceedings and all kinds of new ideas on how to pursue justice.
Yeah, and for me here in the Netherlands, I also have the traditional big UN court, the International Court of Justice, the UN's highest court for disputes between nations, which has become much, much more active in the past few years. And they have had a real focus that they're being used by activists to use the treaties that countries have signed up to challenge their response to mass atrocities. I was at the court yesterday and they told me, I think 50% of their cases came in the last 20 years or something. So it's really, really a very big rise.
Yeah, for a slow-moving court, that's a big change. Well, all of this is kind of in preview to today's show, which is all about Syria. I mean, that's a country that's been subject to some of the most severe international crimes, severe atrocities, but has really only seen a trickle of justice.
And to talk through some of the latest developments on Syria, we have a couple of guests. We have Hope Rikkelman. Hi, Hope.
Good morning.
Hope is the director of the Yazidi Legal Network and has also just been appointed the head of the Nuhanovich Foundation, where she was previously leading the Iraq and Syria project. Congratulations. We should explain a bit what the Nuhanovich Foundation does. On the website, it says it helps secure justice and reparations for civilian victims of war and conflict. In the Netherlands, we know it as one of the driving forces behind a really significant decision on reparations for victims of the Srebrenica massacres, for example.
And we also have Fritz Streiff. Hi, Fritz.
Hi, good morning.
And Fritz is a lawyer at the Nuhanovich Foundation, where he's leading the Ukraine work. And we also know Fritz from his work as fellow podcaster. Most recently, the Syria trials, and before that, Branch 251, which are really great in-depth guides in English and in Arabic to the trials that have been happening in Germany and beyond on Syria under universal jurisdiction. So to start with, I thought, Steph, you could help us with a basic understanding of the case at the International Court of Justice in The Hague, which has been brought by Canada and the Netherlands, I think, against Syria, which is saying that Syria isn't living up to its obligations under the Torture Convention. So Stephopedia away.
Yes, well, Canada and the Netherlands started kind of laying the groundwork for this case in 2020 when the Netherlands announced that it was holding Syria legally responsible for breaches of the Torture Convention. And that's kind of preamble that you have to walk through to make sure that you signal that there is a dispute and then try to go into negotiations before it kind of escalates when those negotiations go nowhere. And only then can you take a case to the International Court of Justice. The case was finally filed earlier this year. And Canada and the Netherlands immediately asked the court to rule on provisional measures, which are kind of like emergency staying measures where you get the court to order something so that the case doesn't get worse while it takes a while for them to hear it. So Canada and the Netherlands asked the court to order Syria essentially to stop torturing.
I remember I was watching to see what was going to happen in the proceedings, and Syria didn't actually turn up. Is that right?
That's right. Syria apparently was negotiating to turn up, and they even asked for a delay at some point where we had a hearing that was delayed again. And then when the moment supreme came, they didn't show up in court. So we heard only one side, which was the Dutch and the Canadians and the Syrian victims talking about what happened to them. And a couple of weeks ago, the court decided that provisional measures were in order. and that Syria basically essentially must do everything it can to stop torture and ensure that nobody under its control can torture. Well, we all know the problem with the ICJ is that they have a wide-ranging jurisdiction and they can order all these things, but they have no way of enforcing this. So those provisional measures are regularly flaunted. I mean, they also ordered Russia to stop the invasion of Ukraine. They did the same with Syria. They're now ordering it to stop torturing, but we don't know what's going to happen. And it doesn't seem like Syria is paying a lot of attention.
What's the big significance of this? I mean, why pay any attention to it?
Well, it is the first international court to basically rule on anything Syria related. The crimes in Syria are blocked from going to the International Criminal Court because Russia and China voted against it in the Security Council to have a resolution to refer that case. Obviously, the Syrian Assad government is not going to prosecute itself for the things that it allegedly does. So that means that there's really no accountability for Syria. And we've seen some universal jurisdiction cases in countries, but the weight of international judges in an international court really looking at it is a different kind of beast.
So let's bring Hope and Fritz in here. Agree, disagree? What do you make of the ICJ's involvement?
I guess just if I can jump in there and start, I think it's a really good signal, right, that states are involved in talking about accountability and being very creative. This is something that Fritz and I have discussed quite often in these cases, you know, when there are impossibilities before, for instance, the ICC or other mechanisms or avenues, you really have to stay creative. And I think that this is one of the examples of that. And having the Netherlands and Canada be involved in this is also a really good statement of saying you have to abide by our conventions that we address together.
You know, to add to that, the fact that Syria is a signatory to the Torture Convention to begin with since 2004, you know, is I guess somewhat surprising, but it does bind them. And I want to push back a little bit on something you said, Stephanie, which is I think the fact that the Syrian government did actually participate in the negotiations, met with the arbiters and the other governments multiple times, exchanged dozens of diplomatic notes on the issues, shows that there is engagement from the Syrian government, that it takes the process seriously. The reason that it didn't show up is unknown. It, of course, was a disappointment. Let's be clear on that. But the engagement, I think, shows that they take it seriously and that a decision that would come in at some point would actually be also a political pressure tool to work with for other governments in discussions and negotiations with the Syrian government in the future as regards transitional justice in Syria in the 2, 5, 10, 20 years to come. And that is not to be underestimated, I think.
Yeah, and we have to say that even if they don't show up for provisional measures, that happens more often, and it doesn't mean that they won't eventually participate in hearings. It's just that it's a long way off.
Okay, so let's move on and let me ask you both, Fritz and Hope, about the case that just opened in the Hague District Court at the end of November. I'm going to hand it over to you, Hope, to tell me basically what it's all about.
For us, this was a very exciting moment, right? We have a 35-year-old Syrian who is indicted or accused of crimes against humanity and also war crimes, as well as participating in Liva al-Quds. And one of the indictments of the public prosecutor's office is that Liva al-Quds is a part of the pro-regime Assad government, and that these activities fall under a part of, you know, the systematic attacks of the civilian populations. And I think that that's just a really, really good signal towards the Syrian community here, specifically in the Netherlands, but also, you know, across the world, that the Netherlands specifically is not a safe haven. We've been working on this for years, so that was very exciting for us to be able to get to this point.
And Fritz, what did you notice, especially if you look at how this is different from the cases that you found or similar to the cases that you followed in Germany?
I think one element that is really striking and that is similar to a lot of the other cases we've been seeing, not only in Germany, but also being developed in mostly other European countries, but also the United States. But we've been seeing activity in Sweden and France very much lately, in Austria, in a bunch of European jurisdictions where we're seeing that the involvement of Syrian civil society, along with their partners in Western countries, has been absolutely crucial to get these cases off the ground, and to use this opportunity, this tool of universal jurisdiction in these national states, instead of addressing their own justice system in Syria, which of course is unfit to administer any type of fair justice, and in the absence of the International Criminal Court, which of course has been blocked by the vetoes in the Security Council. Same goes for a specialized tribunal, which never came for the same reason. So it's been that trend, right, that civil society has been really pushing to use universal jurisdiction to get these cases off the ground, and that the fact that we're seeing them go to trial in an increasing number since 2020, when the first trial in Koblenz started, is, I think, a great testament to the tireless efforts of these groups, especially our Syrian partners, because let's be clear, the frustrations were huge after almost 10 years of no criminal trial regarding any of these regime crimes that have been committed in Syria.
Each time I come across one of these trials, I kind of think, okay, this is it. This is the start. Now the kind of sluice gates are going to open and we're just going to see tons and tons of these cases. Hope, am I mad? I mean, is this kind of the first of many? I mean, do you imagine there'll be more, or am I just a bit too optimistic?
To be honest, I think I like to also stay optimistic. So I share those thoughts with you. I think that if you take into consideration how precedent-setting these cases are, especially in the Netherlands, if you look at the indictment, the public prosecutor also is qualifying Liva Al-Quds as a criminal organization whose purpose is to commit international crimes. And the case itself, I think in that sense, it is very much the doors towards the next cases in setting these precedents. And I think that's really important for the legal framework. So I definitely agree with this. It's also a signal towards the community, right? The general community, but also the Syrian community, that they do have options to share their stories. They do have options to come forward with what happened to them and share evidence where possible. So I think in that light, it's also a really good signal. I've been in touch with quite a few Syrians here in the Netherlands that sent me messages after the 2 hearings this week. Just total praise and happy that something was being done and that they had some kind of hopeful view of the future in talking about accountability and justice. So I think in that sense, it's also very much a good step forward.
And there's 2 things sort of that are good to keep in mind. I think one is that the justice process it's unfortunate, but it's just the way it is a lot slower than the political process. These things happen at very different speeds, and I think it is right, Janet, what you're saying, that with the Koblenz trial that started in 2020, it was a first of many to come. And like we said, in multiple national jurisdictions, cases really developing or going to trial, arrest warrants being issued. Now, another thing that I think is good to keep in mind is these national jurisdictions are, of course, not perfect. And, Stephanie, you asked for sort of comparative observations of how these trials have been going, right? And I think, yes, it is, bizarre that the first criminal trial against the Syrian regime or against representatives of the Syrian regime would happen in a country, in a city called Koblenz in Germany that probably nobody had ever heard of before, in German, and it was difficult to access the court, and it was COVID, there was a global pandemic, and those circumstances are definitely not perfect. But I think that trial with its 108 trial days was a really good, at the end of the day, clean exercise of justice. And as Hope said, it meant so much to Syrians to finally be heard by a court of law in the whole framework of a functioning rule of law system, where the accused would have the right to defend himself, where the entire process was executed according to a set of rules that make sense and is not arbitrary. And the same goes for the trial that we've now seen in The Hague in the past couple of days. It's very different. There was only 2 final hearing days, very different from the German system, much less of an opportunity to really go through the entire exercise and show not only to the participating parties, but also to the world what the whole case is about. So there's these differences, but I think the general thing to keep in mind is that for it to be that sort of third best option, I think they're doing a really good job. And there is more coming. Maybe we can talk about that in a second, what we're expecting to see in the next few years. But I think it'll be good, and it'll be a slow but continuous process of building a strong dossier of evidence, also for future purposes of history writing and archiving, that will make very clear what the regime did in Syria.
And Hope, I just want to get back to you. I wanted to ask you if you can explain a bit how the court case went, what you followed, what they said, and why this is kind of a new thing for the Netherlands, because we've had other trials of war crimes in Syria, but this one stands out. And can you explain why? And can you maybe give us a little recounting of what those 2 days were like?
Yeah, absolutely. Maybe just to begin with the fact that the pretrial phase was a very long period. I don't know exactly by heart how long it was, but I know for sure a lot of the pretrial hearings I went to, I think over a time frame of about a year, maybe a year and a half, and very much leading up to these 2 trial hearing days, which Fritz already mentioned, like it's something very specific in the Netherlands, that the hearing days or the trial days themselves are very specific towards the public prosecutor, explaining what the charges are and what the facts are of the case, and then having the charges explained. After that, there is an option for the witnesses and the direct victim to have a victim statement. So I think that that's also very, very good in the Netherlands, that they take the room and space and opportunity to be able to say something about the crimes that were committed against them, what that means personally for them, but also to say something about the charges specifically.
Before you dive into the case, Hope, let me just explain the Dutch system. As you explained, they have very long kind of pretrial hearings where they talk all about what they investigate. And then the trial itself in the Netherlands is usually only a few days. And what you get essentially is the judges reading from the dossier of investigation. And so you don't get witnesses testifying live in court, but what you do get is judges kind of reading from witness statements, from testimony, from reports, and putting these things to the defense, and in this case also the defendant, and asking them, we found all this, what is your comment? In this case, I don't think he commented on anything. But that's the way a Dutch trial works. It's not at all like the American movies, and there's usually not a lot of drama. And all the quotes and all the color you get from victims who testify is all from judges quoting from that. So that is to set the scene. And now Hope you can dive into what happened in those 2 days. I only saw a bit of the first day, and that was a lot of judges reading from the file and him saying, "I rely on my right to remain silent."
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and maybe just to add on to that is that in the pretrial phase, the investigative judge does the hearings of the witnesses and the survivors, the victims. So that's a really important phase as well, which we were quite involved in the sense that we were trying to support the victims and the survivors, and also the organizations behind that. For the first trial day specifically, one thing that was very powerful and very important for us as an organization also to highlight was the statement of the victim. So the victim was not present, unfortunately, and maybe Fritz can explain that a little bit in a second, but I think that having that room and space within the trials in the Netherlands is very important for them to explain what this means to them, what their life looks like now, and they can also say something even about the charges and the length of the potential prison sentence. So I think those were the main points for the first day. And the second day was very much in light of the defendant explaining why they didn't agree with the charges of the public prosecutor's office. I think that the judges should have a verdict on the 22nd of January. So even looking at that process, it's very quick. So a lot of the momentum of the trial was very much before the trial itself, very much in the pre-trial phases.
And before we move on to what else we can expect this year, I asked Fritz already about the difference between Dutch and German courts, and you talked a lot about the process. But I'm wondering, what about the practicalities? The Dutch had translation, they had the live stream, which is what I watched. And I'm wondering, was that, as I remember complaints in the Koblenz trial, that it was hard to follow for victims? So I'm wondering, did that warm your heart to see that here? And was that very different from how they did it in Germany?
It warmed my heart, and in a way, it blew my mind. In fact, it's not an exaggeration, and not the fact that accessibility to in-court interpretation to Arabic for Syrian participants in the public gallery, but also in the live stream that the court made available, and that we helped with the Nuhanovic Foundation to spread the word about, and for Syrians all over the world to be able to tune in and follow and listen to the live in-court interpretation. I mean, the fact that was made possible, and in the let's say relatively practical Dutch way, there wasn't nobody even had to file a motion in this regard, and not us, not the lawyers. It was just in conversation over the past few years between the prosecutor's office and us, together with our Syrian partner. We had that conversation. We requested this to be the case, and it was no problem, which, in my opinion, is not surprising, because it is just that easy. What is mind-blowing is that it wasn't possible in Koblenz, and that it took, 3 or 4 motions by civil society organizations and participating civil party lawyers to keep arguing for why it was necessary, not just clearly for the participating Syrians, but also for documentation purposes, right? And for archiving, for being able to make sure that the clear historic significance of that trial would be recognized. I mean, mind blowing that was, until the very last day of the trial, that was upheld. On that very last day, they made the in-court translation interpretation accessible to everyone in the public gallery, which showed that it was possible all along. So yeah, you're hearing my lingering frustration. We appreciate the practical approach by the Dutch authorities, and that's should be a good example for jurisdictions all over the world.
Yeah, maybe just to add on to that as well it's really a good example of supporting each other, right? I think one thing at the Nuhanovic Foundation we really believe in is not just access to justice for survivors and witnesses of international crimes, but more specifically being able to support each other. And I think that in this specific instance also that, and these are my own personal words, but I think that the public prosecutor office was also very happy with us in supporting that process, making sure we could provide the link to the larger community and reach out and make sure that people knew that this link was accessible. So I think that's also a really, really good step in the right direction.
And let me just add, Stephanie, because you asked about comparisons and differences and stuff, and we both just confirmed we appreciate how this went. Clearly, there are things along the process that, again, also when you compare to other cases, not just in other national jurisdictions, but even at the highly specialized International Criminal Court, right? As regards witness security issues that remain a problem. And I mean, we can talk about this for a long time, but it's probably in the very nature of the beast that will remain a difficult issue, because we are talking about some of the most complex and grave crimes you can imagine. But there are things that we continue to advocate for, also in the Netherlands, including making sure that the witnesses that we also work with and that we try to get involved in these cases, and these cases rely heavily on witness testimony, as you know, that these witnesses feel comfortable and secure to participate, that they have access to legal representation, to psychosocial support. Those are things that we as an organization very much advocate for, and that we try to help manage and set up and provide. But we do believe that somewhat of more of an effort from the state side in providing this kind of support, for example, concretely, to make legal representation for witnesses in these complex international crimes cases available as a rule, as a state-funded rule. That's something that we continue to advocate for.
Yeah, so just to explain, it isn't right now. So there is no legal aid for these witnesses. And like Fritz mentioned, the cases are very heavily based on these testimonies. We don't do this only for Syrian cases, but also for other cases that we're working on.
We're going to move on to another Syria-related justice development. It's really a sense for me of, like they say with London buses, you can see none and then suddenly three come along at once. So we also have in France some arrest warrants being issued by a judge there against Syria's president Bashar al-Assad, his brother Mahar al-Assad, and two other senior officials over the use of banned chemical weapons against civilians in Syria. And just to point out, we're going to do a full chemical weapons podcast in the new year, because I think there's some really interesting developments going on that Stephanie, in her moonlighting as a Reuters correspondent, has been covering as well. But let's just start off with this stuff in France. Again, over to either of you. Should we start with you, Fritz? What's the case about? Who are the plaintiffs? How has it come about?
Yeah, before I start talking about that, just very quickly, there's another case that's going to trial in France in May 2024 that's already been scheduled and dated against very high-ranking officials, among them Jamal Hassan, former head of the notorious Air Force intelligence, Ali Mamlouk, who really was, or maybe still is, the second most powerful person in the regime heading the security services. And they've been indicted, and the trial is scheduled for May next year in Paris. It'll likely be in absentia trial. Yeah,
I was going to ask, that will be in absentia, but looks like France is the place where things are happening.
Part of that reason is that they have the option to go for in absentia trials, which many other national jurisdictions don't, right? And that we can have another discussion on whether that's a good thing or not. But it is happening, and we do hear from our Syrian partners that it has a very strong meaning for them to be taken seriously. For the direct victims in this case, we've met them in Paris. That's a development to keep on the radar for May next year. Now, onto the chemical weapons case. Both of these cases have been in the making for years and years and years, right? The chemical weapons attacks that we're talking about happened in August 2013. It's 10 years ago, more than 10 years ago. We started working on this case in 2017 in a coalition of NGOs, Syrian and Western, and we started building the case really from the very ground, just collecting information on the crimes, on the context of the crimes, and then slowly collecting information from witnesses, from insider witnesses, to not only show how the crimes occurred, but also how they were organized, how these chemical weapons attacks as a state-run way of attacking its own civilian population was managed. The cases were filed in 3 jurisdictions, in Germany first, and then in France and in Sweden. And the French have taken it forward. So have the Germans and the Swedes. They also opened investigations, but the French have now publicly announced arrest warrants for Bashar and Mahar al-Assad and 2 high officials of the chemical weapons development program inside Syria. That is, of course, a huge victory for the survivors and the victims' families from those attacks, where more than 1,000 people died of gas in just a few hours in the morning of the 21st of August 2013. I mean, I was involved in reviewing some of the imagery and video evidence in this case before we filed, and it was the hardest thing that I've probably done in my professional life. Just looking at what these gases did to those people, including the elderly and very small babies. We were just expecting our first child at the time, and that thing just broke my heart. It was very hard, and I'm just, like I said, it's a victory for everyone that has worked so tirelessly on this case, that not only were these investigations open, but these arrest warrants are now official. Let's talk about what they mean, but the fact alone that this has happened is massive.
Also, let's just say that it's not just us making the claims about the chemical attack. The OPCW, the Organization for the Prevention of Chemical Weapons, has found that Syria used sarin and chlorine gas in attacks. And of course, Bashar al-Assad is indicted, as also his position as a commander of the armed forces. Hope, can I ask you, how do you think France is going to deal with the immunity of a head of state issue? Because a French court is not an international tribunal, and this is a tenet of international law that you have head of state immunity before national courts usually.
Yeah, Stephanie, good question. I think, we all know that immunity of sitting heads of states cannot serve as a bar to prosecute by international courts, right? We've seen this with al-Bashir, but the question of whether personal immunity can prevent national jurisdictions from enforcing arrest warrants or cases has always kind of divided the international community. And like you said, I really think that this is the first time that no immunities for international crime principle has been applied in a national jurisdiction, and not just against a high-level official or high-level perpetrator, but against the sitting head of state, Assad of a different nation. So I think when we talk about being creative, again, kind of reaching back to that, or the political will, this is a really, really, really good example of that. I also suspect that this will be the biggest defense argument, immunity. But to be honest, I have no idea how this will unfold. Again, I stay positive, and I think that this is a good thing.
Stephanie, the thing with this immunity question is, of course, we don't know, and we cannot know how the French investigative judges came to the conclusion that in this case, immunities will not bar them from even officially publishing these arrest warrants. I mean, these individuals are now on the Interpol list, right? So we don't know. It's the secrecy of the file, but what we can guess is that the very grave nature of these chemical weapons attacks. I mean, the international norm that was broken by attacking your own population with sarin gas, that as a violation of international law weighs so heavily and qualifies as youth Gogans, that it breaks through that prohibition of investigating and prosecuting and putting on trial even heads of state, current heads of states. And that is of course a very exciting development. Now, it may not uphold, right? Let's be realistic. There's a whole process to still go through, and let's see where it goes. At the same time, though, just around the same time, a group of Syrian civil society organizations have called for a international chemical weapons tribunal to be established, right? That brings us to the beginning of this part of the discussion, which is if that was to be created, then immunities may not be an issue anymore, since it would be an internationally established tribunal, and how exactly that would work regarding immunities is another question, but it would make prosecutions also of heads of states more likely. I think in that sense, we should also see these various investigations happening at the same time in Germany, in Sweden, in France. The idea is that perhaps a solution to bringing all of that information together at some point is such a chemical weapons tribunal in the future.
That really seems like a good place to wrap up and to move on to our regular questions that we have at the end. I'm really hesitant with both of you to ask you if there's anything that we haven't mentioned that you would like to mention, because I have the sense that there's another flood of stuff that you all want to get in here. But, is there anything?
I mean, Janet, I have to say, I will shamelessly plug my own podcast, the Syria Trials, right? In the second season, we go through a case, the Al-Halabi case, and I will just leave it at that. Everybody should know about this case and how it's developed. It's all in season 2, so we don't have to talk about it here on the podcast. But it is an interesting case.
Shameless plugging is absolutely acceptable. No problem at all. Thank you for that. Maybe we'll just move on to our last question that we always ask, which is whether there's stuff that you have been listening to or reading or watching recently that you would like to share with us. Hope, what have you been up to? Or something you do to switch off from this world that we're in?
I have this really bad thing of reading books that also are about international crimes, war crimes, survivors. And my partner always tells me not to take these books in my downtime or read them in my downtime or on vacation. So this time I have a book which is kind of personal to me. It's a really easy read that I'm reading. It's called The Bus Out of Mostar. I have a very personal connection to the Balkans. I spent a lot of time there. And I also, in my spare time, I play handball. And this book is actually about a team of young ladies being taken to the Netherlands specifically to flee the war under the discard of going to have to play a handball team tournament in the Netherlands. So yeah, a little bit of an easy read, but also explaining the war in former Yugoslavia and from the perspective of young handball players. So it's a good read.
So Fritz, are you going to surprise us by picking something that isn't reading legal files deep into the night?
Yes, actually, I have the same tendency. Of course, I mean, I think most of your guests probably share that. I really try very hard since a couple of years to resist that.
Which is difficult, very difficult.
Very difficult. But I try. And one of the things that has worked for me lately, especially since the 7th of October and everything that has happened since, which has in many ways just left me more hopeless than I've ever been. And it's, speechless is another word that has been in my head a lot. So I really try to get different things and beautiful things into my head. And one of the things that's been working for me quite nicely is poetry, sort of going back to poetry, which I hadn't read in a while. And there's this one poem that I recently really enjoyed, and I keep reading it back. Maybe because it relates a little bit to justice, but it's a very different take on it. And it's called The Just by Jorge Luis Borges. And it gives the reader a very beautiful perspective on what really actually in the end matters in our life and in this world. I suggest everybody who needs a bit of a shot of beauty to read it.
Thank you. We'll put a link up on the website to that as well, and a picture of the bus out of Mostar, which sounds like nice read. So nice to have something a bit positive as well. Thank you both very much for your time.
Thank you.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
Before we sign off, we have to say that podcast next year about chemical weapons will, of course, also deal with the call for the establishment of the Chemical Weapons Tribunal, which I reported on and spoke to some very, very impressive witnesses and people trying to make that happen. So that is upcoming in the new year. But thank you both so much for your time.
This was Asymmetrical Haircuts, your international justice podcast. Created and presented by Janet Anderson and Stephanie van den Berg. This episode was produced in partnership with justiceinfo.net, an independent site covering justice effort for mass violence. Music is by audionautics.com, and you can find show notes and everything about the podcast on asymmetricalhaircuts.com. This show is available on every major podcast service, so please subscribe, give us a rating, and spread the word.